This video is sponsored by TENZO.
Hey, welcome back. My name is Emilee Bryant and I am a coffee educator, but today I'm a matcha educator. The first mistake is arguably the easiest to fix, using low-quality matcha.
To start with the basics, matcha is green tea, or more specifically, Camellia sinensis. But not all matcha is created equal. Generally, you'll see two categories of matcha in the wild: ceremonial grade and culinary grade. Culinary grade matchas are exactly as they sound, primarily used for cooking, or for smoothies or anything that's going to have enough sugar and cream to cut the bitterness. Culinary grade matchas are made up of the more robust leaves from the lower sections of the plant.
Culinary grade is typically lower quality matcha. It's a lot more bitter.
And the inverse of culinary is ceremonial grade. Ceremonial grade are leaves that are picked from the top of the plant and harvested on the first season. These leaves are typically a more vibrant green and consist of less bitterness and more of a sweet umami flavor. And ceremonial grade matchas can be 2 to 5 times the price of culinary grade.
Another way of telling is by literally looking at the color, because you can discern poor quality matcha from high quality matcha. Now, not all the time, but for the most part, they are worlds apart.
But if you don't know where to find matcha for yourself or for your shop, you should check out today's sponsor, TENZO. Coffee shop owners and baristas, listen up. If you're looking to elevate your menu and offer your customers drinks they're gonna love, TENZO Wholesale Matcha is your one-stop shop. TENZO Matcha is sourced from the finest tea leaves in Japan, and they offer the best quality wholesale matcha for the price here in the USA. Plus, you'll receive marketing materials and monthly recipe inspirations to keep your coffee shop offerings fresh and exciting. So if you're ready to serve your customers the best matcha, check out the link in the video description and fill out the TENZO wholesale form to get yourself a free sample kit. And then you and I will be messing with the same matcha. We'll be twins. Thank you, TENZO, for sponsoring this video.
Next up is using the wrong water temperature. The issue with brewing too hot is that you're likely to release more catechins.
Catechins are antioxidants found naturally in matcha, and higher quality matchas tend to contain more of these antioxidants. Catechins extract at higher temperatures, so the hotter you go, the more catechins will end up extracted in the matcha. And this could dominate your palate with a bitter and astringent flavor.
So we want to limit the amount of catechins that can actually activate in our matcha for our taste. To show this point, I actually brewed a couple different matchas, one at a very low temperature, one in more of a medium around 165, which is the traditional way to brew it, and then one right off the boil, the hottest water I can get.
Brewing with colder water will prevent more catechins from releasing. However, that doesn't mean that cold water is your best solution. It depends on the scenario. From my results, I found that brewing with colder water not only meant you'd see less foam in your matcha, but it left a more grassy flavor with an emphasis on umami sweetness. Though I would hesitate to say this was my favorite. In fact, the middle one at 165 Fahrenheit was actually the one I preferred. Now, I might be biased because this is the only way I've ever made matcha through my matcha drinking journey, but this is the one I found to have the most balance, that had some qualities of bitterness and some of those umami and sweetness that you'd typically find in matcha and at lower temperatures. And the results from the boiling water were as expected. Very bitter, very harsh, and the least palatable of all three.
Using the wrong temp can also apply to your milk. If you're over steaming your milk and you are going past the 160 Fahrenheit mark, eventually your milk is going to simply break down the proteins, fall apart, and become really poorly textured and start to taste really bad in your matcha. So you want to make sure that you're balancing your temperatures here. You also have to consider, typically when people make matcha, they make it colder. So if you're going to pour milk into matcha, it's gonna already be a little colder, making your drink overall a little bit colder. So while I wouldn't recommend you really go past 160 Fahrenheit, I would recommend you go a little hotter when you're steaming your milk and hit right around that point, and you should be golden. Next up is you're using the wrong ratio, at least for yourself.
Ratio is of course preferential, but the idea behind getting it right is to prevent you from wasting more matcha or using too much milk and wasting more milk. For example, creating a tighter ratio for your matcha, where you use more matcha and less water, can still penetrate milk, but that's only when you're using more matcha. And this is wasteful for 2 reasons. You'll need more matcha to power through the milk, and because you're using a smaller amount of water, you're going to be using more milk in the volume of your beverage. Where alternatively, you could create a shot of matcha using more water and less milk, which will allow the matcha flavor to dominate the milk without needing as much concentration.
I actually have 2 recipes that I'd recommend for you today. One simple recipe for when you want to pour slightly stronger version of this drink, and the other one is going to be a more traditional style shot that we're actually going to go off of TENZO's recipe from their website.
Recipe number 1 has more matcha in a tighter ratio and is designed to be for latte art in a 6 to 8 ounce cup. The recipe is 2 to 3 teaspoons or 2 to 3.5 grams of matcha cut with 20 to 35 mils of water. And our other ratio is actually borrowed from TENZO's website. Recipe number 2, or our TENZO shot, is 1 teaspoon or 1.5 to 2 grams of matcha cut with 2 ounces or 58 mils of water. This is a great base for anything that you're going to mix with milk or anything you're going to make inside of your cafe beverages. If you're trying to go for something a little stronger or more latte art forward, I would recommend recipe number 1.
Next up, you're probably storing your matcha incorrectly. Even if you buy the most premium matcha, you could still f it up.
Matcha is a very delicate product. From the moment you open it, it is working against you to oxidize. Oxidation occurs at the atomic scale when an atom or group of atoms loses an electron, and this happens all around you. It's even happening to you.
We see this whenever we cut open fruit. You can actually see the oxidation happen over time. If you've ever had an apple that turned brown, that's oxidation. That's why it's imperative that you keep your matcha stored either back in the bag and zipped up or in a sealed tin.
You can also store your matcha in the fridge. However, you should ensure that it is an airtight container because opening the fridge will increase the humidity that gets into your matcha, causing clumps. And when you remove it from the fridge, you should let the matcha acclimate to room temperature before you use it.
If you leave matcha out, it'll actually turn quite yellow over time, and that's the effect of the oxidation. It's gonna leave you with a more dull, unpleasant matcha that's gonna maybe probably be more bitter, less sweet, less aromatic. You're just not getting the freshness that you want from your matcha. And you're actually getting less of the antioxidant properties from the matcha the longer it ages. So it's best to drink it fast and store it efficiently in a cool, dark place in an airtight container. Moving on, not using a sieve or a sieve. Sieve? Sieve? Sieve, sieve. You absolutely don't need to go out and buy a sieve, but if you did use a sieve, you will avoid a lot of the clumps that are in your bag of matcha.
Even if you're using an airtight container like I just told you to do, you'll still see some clumps of matcha over time. And we want to prevent that from getting into your beverage and causing an intense flavor in random spots of your drink. Here's an example where I use the sieve and you can actually see the clumps left behind. You don't want that in your matcha, do you? You weird freak?
I'm just joking. You're not a freak. You're cool. You're cool. That's why you use a sieve. Like me. Next up, we have mixing the matcha incorrectly.
How you prepare your matcha matters. So today we're going to prepare matchas with 4 different styles. One using the nano foamer, which will pull the matcha in the liquid through its mesh screen. Next, we're going to use a traditional matcha whisk made of 100% bamboo. And we're going to treat this like we typically would for matcha whisking, in a W or an M for matcha formation. We're also going to shake the matcha in a shaker.
And then finally, we're going to use what had claimed it was a matcha gun, but I'm not exactly sold on that idea. You just pop this up and like this. You're telling me that's a matcha gun? Out of all of these experiments, the shaking performed the worst. You can still physically see the clumps left behind after I shook it.
The nano foamer did not do as great as I thought it would. That being said, it still was able to mix the matcha. It just created coarser bubbles and it took a little bit longer and was a little bit messy doing so. However, if the nano foamer were in a taller cup and you were doing this for a to-go matcha, I could see it performing a lot better, creating a deeper vortex.
Whisking traditionally ended up creating the most froth, but also created the best texture in my opinion.
But using a traditional whisk does come with a caveat of having to pre-soak the whisk and of course batching the matcha every time in a larger bowl and then cleaning the bowl. Next up we have the matcha gun. This did not do great. It took about 2 minutes to thoroughly mix the matcha, and while it did create a nice network of foam, it is of course still a traditional matcha whisk at the end of it. I found this to be quite loud, very time consuming, and overall kind of silly.
And it would pop off occasionally if it's not super secure.
Like, I guess you could use this in a cafe, but I honestly think that the traditional whisk is just faster. One last method I did not mention earlier is that you could actually pre-batch your matcha and put them into a squeeze bottle. If your primary product is matcha lattes, then this is a great way to store some matcha pre-prepared and save yourself a little time during busy rushes. I'd recommend 8 to 10 shots pre-prepped in the same ratios you would normally use to make these shots in-house. I would make sure that you shake the bottle every time you're about to use it because matcha is of course a suspension and not fully dissolved in liquid. I'm gonna use this based off its original intention. Next up, we got the wrong milk. You brought the wrong milk. A lot of people that are drinking matcha want it for its health benefits, and they might not align as a milk drinker. Now, if you're avoiding whole milk altogether and you're using alternative milks, any milk should be fine. But if latte art is your goal, then I'd recommend you look for one that says barista on the label. These milks tend to come with a bit more emulsifiers and fat. They can make your milk a lot more creamy and better for latte art. But one thing I would recommend against is if you're picking out 2% milk for your lattes. 2% with its lack of fat tends to fluff up more than whole milk, meaning if latte art is something that you're interested in, you might want to texture less with 2% milk. Here's an example that I was going through. I tried to get this 2% milk to act the same as my regular latte art, and I was struggling until I reduced the amount of air that I needed to add, and then the 2% code was cracked. If you are whisking your matcha in milk, or you're steaming the matcha with milk, you're being weird.
Don't be weird.
Going back to the topic of catechins, being antioxidants, we do want some of the health benefits that they provide. However, there are reports that mixing your matcha with milk instead of with water will allow the catechins to bind with the milk's casein proteins, making it harder for your body to absorb those nutrients later on. And when you do it this way, a lot of the matcha will get clumped down at the bottom anyway, and you'll have a bunch of clumps of matcha at the bottom of your pitcher that you gotta clean, and that's not going in your drink, and it's a waste of product, and it just isn't good. Don't do it. Next up, we have using the wrong water. Similar to coffee, matcha is mostly water. But if you're using water that isn't the highest quality, say it's unfiltered water or it's water straight from the tap in a high mineral area, that's going to affect the taste of your matcha. To give you an example of acceptable minerality, the United States sits somewhere around 300 parts per million or below. Of course, I'm not expecting you to know the exact number of your water. You can make this a lot easier by simply using distilled water and adding back minerals through companies like Third Wave Water, which has prepackaged minerals for you, or Lotus Water, where you can individually add drops to get to the acquired number you're looking for. Or you don't have to do any of this, and you can take it so easy breezy and just get a Brita filter. Number 9 is using the wrong cup. Most people tend to use tall mugs when they're making drinks, but what's going to serve you better in your latte art is using a cup that is in the shape of a bowl. Using a bowl-shaped cup allows your pitcher to get closer to the surface sooner, allowing you to create more definition in your lines. A taller cup requires you to fill the cup up more before you can physically get close to the surface, reducing the amount of things you can pour into your latte art and leaving you with a stiffer surface because you've added more foam up to this point. Okay, moving on, we have number 10, your design is disappearing. Continuing on the theme of latte art, if you find your matcha design is disappearing, there could be a few reasons for this. There are two main causes of no design appearing in your matcha. The first one is thin milk, and this is true generally for latte art, but especially for matcha. Matcha froth can sometimes be a bit thick, and it can feel stiff and resist your latte art as a whole. And if your milk is thin, you won't stand a chance. The other common issue is pouring too high from the surface of the liquid. The higher you are from the surface, the more beige the white will appear in your matcha. And for this, you'll just want to get closer to the surface so that we're gliding foam on top of foam. Lastly, you might be hesitating too much with your milk before you pour. Even if your milk is perfectly textured, you want to continuously swirl your milk and not hesitate when you are about to pour. The longer you wait, the more that milk is trying to rise in your pitcher, preventing you from actually pouring the design, because you're just gonna get a big old blob on your big old drink. So what you gotta do is you gotta swirl it, and I mean swirl it till you don't think you can anymore, till that milk is coming up to the sides of the pitcher. Then you know, you're good to go. To avoid the stiff matcha issue altogether, regardless of your milk texture and height, either sieve your matcha before pouring, or you can try to break up the matcha foam by swirling the matcha after you've integrated. Here's an example of one pour with the sieve and the other one using a swirl immediately after integration. And you can only imagine how much better this technique works if you do both. You can always whisk your matcha without foam, though this will create a less uniform suspension. There is of course nothing wrong with this if you're mixing a ton of milk with your beverage. Alrighty, I actually lied and I have 11. I have one more for you guys. Be aware of your environment. Matcha and coffee and all things that we consume require our presence and our attention. Is it too loud or is it too blue in your environment? That can affect how you drink your matcha. So what I'd recommend to you for this last bonus tip is to find yourself in a state of presence, in a place that is peaceful. I recommend maybe going to a tea room somewhere. If you're in New York, there's quite a few of them. Or maybe going into your house and turning off the music and the TV or in your headphones and sit with your matcha and be present. Make sure to sub, make sure to like, share it with your friends and family. I don't want to hear from you until you've done that. And cheers.